All right, everybody, welcome to another great Digital Hollywood session and truly an all-star panel here where we're going to be talking about a topic that's near and dear to everybody, the AI royalty marketplace, licensing, monetization, and revenue share, or what I like to call how AI developers get what they need and content owners get what they deserve. So we will get into it here, but it's a great panel. And first, before we begin, into the topics, I'm just going to go around the room and everybody, let's give brief introductions. We'll talk about your respective companies later in the discussion, but just like one to 2 minutes each about your background. So Rebecca, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Um, Hi, everyone. I lead strategic partnerships at the Times as the CEO's chief of staff. And so that means I look after our relationships with most of the biggest tech platforms and companies that the Times works with, just to make sure that we're getting what we need and want out of all of them, from kind of like the newsroom to product to commercial, including deals that we do. And that is increasingly been around generative AI. So I'm responsible for figuring out how we protect and monetize our AI. And I've been in on the business side of news for more than 20 years, figuring out how to make it a viable business model and get lots and lots of people to pay for news.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. And Howie, how about you?
Sure. Good to be here. Hi, everybody. I'm Howie Singer. I started my career at Bell Labs a long time ago. After getting my PhD from Cornell, I eventually became the chief technologist for the strategy group at Warner Music. Worked there for 15 years, and I was involved in all the licensing deals with the tech companies, whether that was Spotify or YouTube or Apple. I now consult on AI technology issues for the music business. I teach data analytics in the NYU Music Business Program. And I wrote a book called Key Changes, the 10 Times Technology Transformed the Music Industry. Starts with the phonograph, ends with AI. There's a lot of lessons in that book that apply to our topic today, and I'm sure we'll get to discuss some of them.
Yes, we will. Absolutely. And Dave, how about you?
Hey, everybody. Great to be here. My name is Dave Davis. I'm Chief Content Officer at a company called Protege, which we'll talk more about later. But in essence, we license audiovisual works to AI companies for model training. My background, I started a long time ago at Goldman Sachs, and then I went off and practiced law for a couple of years, but then went into business roles around Hollywood. So I spent time at Paramount, at Universal, at 20th Century Fox and a couple of other places. So long time content licensing executive.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. And Mickey.
Hey, I'm Mickey. I'm the CRO at Vermilio. I've been about 2 decades in media entertainment partnership or executive roles, mostly with mid to small size tech companies. Previous to Vermilio, I was one of the founding employees of a place called Dapper Labs. Dapper Labs, essentially, for better or for worse, invented the NFT and kind of brought it into the world, into the zeitgeist with NBA Top Shot. So I spent a good 5.5 years there, and now have found myself in the generative AI space naturally.
Excellent. And then just a little background about me. I'm Peter Chatty, Creative Media. That's my firm. I started out as an entertainment lawyer, IP, then going into the studios, becoming a deal maker. And then I was a serial entrepreneur, and how we may have come across each other when I was president of Music Match and several other tech forward media companies. And then for the past 10 years, working in the kind of the intersection of technology and media and where it's all going. And in the AI world, I represent media companies in the types of things we're talking about today, licensing of their content. But I'm also a very vocal proponent for content owners to get the kind of compensation that we're going to be talking about today whenever their content is used, which is what I believe is ultimately fundamental. And I think that's where the world is going to be going. So we'll be talking about that. And this is a great panel to discuss all these issues. And just to quickly set the stage, there are reports that up to $1 trillion will be spent by the tech companies in terms of their investment in AI. And so when we're talking about the what's at issue here? We're just talking about how content owners whose content is absolutely essential for the value of the generative AI that we're going to be talking about. Without the content, there is no commercial value to it. So how do they come into play and participate in the unlock of generative AI? That's what we're going to be talking about. And so let's start with the licensing market, kind of the state of play as it is today, where there is a growing, vibrant, one-to-one licensing market. And Rebecca, I'm going to open it up to you because it's very interesting where the New York Times has probably the most important, or at least the most high profile litigation in the generative AI space against Microsoft and OpenAI. And we discussed that in another panel. But for purposes here, at the same time, you just recently entered into a licensing agreement with Amazon. And tell us about that, and tell us about just first, I guess, the philosophy going into the deal, and then as much as you can tell us about the deal itself.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, look, obviously, I can't share too much about our commercial terms. It's true for any deal, but I'm happy to talk to you about the thinking behind all of it. I mean, first to say that we're really excited about the deal that we did with Amazon. We think it means that the Times' content will be that much more accessible to people, and we'll be able to kind of experiment and understand how these tools and products are being used by consumers, and importantly, how our content is showing up, which is going to be crucial for our understanding of the ecosystem as these products continue to evolve. So we think it's a really, good foundation of a relationship. And I would just say, in terms of how it relates to the suit, it's really not a divergence at all from our strategy. I sort of talk about it or see it as two sides of the same coin. It's really consistent with our long-held principle that high-quality journalism is worth paying for. I mean, that is our strategy: make content worth paying for. And so it aligns with our approach to making sure that our work is valued appropriately, whether that's through a commercial deal, or through the enforcement of our intellectual property rights. And I'll just say one last thing, and Peter, I know you've and probably everyone here has read our complaint closely, so you'll know that we have always been really open to the idea of striking the right kind of commercial relationships with companies who kind of recognize and are consistent with our principles. And those principles are, fair value exchange for our work, approaching our agreements in a way that's sustainable, by which I mean they don't have to be decades-long agreements, but they are ones that we feel are sort of setting and establishing the right precedent for what they're getting and what we're getting. And then ultimately respecting the rights of our journalism and content so that we understand how our content is being used and can control, to at least some degree, how it's displayed and used in the tools that they're using it for. So that's ultimately what we're trying to do there.
And by the way, I think that's really important. What you said there is that frequently you hear the tech community, or at least many in the tech community, who say that the media companies and content owners, copyright owners, are trying to stop technology, to slow us down. And that's not the case at all. The case, I think what you said is exactly right. It's just about consent and fair compensation for the use of the content. So participation in this unlock. And so I appreciate you laying that out. One question about that. Can you describe whether the deal itself addresses training or RAG and/or output/display?
Sure. I mean, we've described it a bit publicly already, so I'm not sharing anything we haven't said already, but it is for kind of the full scope of uses of our content. So yes, training, as well as fine-tuning RAG and outputs and display.
Okay. And we'll get into that. Everybody who's out there, we'll get into that a little bit more too. And Howie, I'm going to ask you a question about, okay, so that's the New York Times. And if the New York Times is out there being very vocal, carrying the flag for content owners, and doing both the enforcement of it, but also proactively working with the developers to license its content. Why do we not see the traditional Hollywood studios out there really enforcing, except now they just for the first time a few weeks ago, they filed their first litigation against Midjourney. But why do you believe that's the case?
I believe it took a while until they saw the threat outweigh the benefits, right? I mean, during the writer and director strike, one could argue they were on opposite sides from some of the creators and the restrictions that the writers and directors wanted in their agreements. And some of that is because, if you're doing a CGI movie, if you're doing a crowd at a football game, there's lots of places where AI generated content is going to be helpful in terms of reducing costs in production, in special effects, and in other things. However, when Midjourney in particular started showing videos that included this guy named Darth Vader, you might have heard of him. He's kind of funny. Suddenly, that was a bigger issue. Wait, you're making movies with our characters and trained on our content and didn't pay us for the rights to this? I mean, if an advertiser tomorrow, did a commercial with Darth Vader, you can bet, that Lucasfilms would go after them. And that's exactly what happened. So I think the balance between what were the benefits and the costs shifted somewhat given the progress that had been made on the video model side.
Yeah. And can you imagine if it was the other way around, if somehow somebody was utilizing the technology of Midjourney without paying them? It's kind of interesting how it's, the way it's thought of.
I mean, that happened with DeepSeek, right? And that was
exactly where Sam Altman came out and was very vocal about the fact that they're taking our patented technology. Absolutely. So Howie, what you said, the conflicted nature of Hollywood, where it wants to use these tools, but at the same time understands that, what you were just explaining.
It's no different for music. It was announced this week that Warner Music, my former company, has job openings for people specializing in AI applied to processes that the company has. The predictive models that are used to look at social activity and streaming activity and figure out which artists are going to be more successful in the future. Those are machine learning models. All the companies want to use these tools. They're not against using these tools. They just believe that if you're going to create a song about surfing and summer weather and the beach with complicated vocal harmonies and a theremin, that maybe the Beach Boys should get a piece of that as remuneration.
Yeah, it seems pretty fair. So yes, for everybody out there, all the major labels, they have sued Suno, which is one of the generative music companies, and Udio, another one. And so that litigation is ongoing, but the rumblings are that there's discussions going on about licensing the content, which I would imagine is ultimately going to be the case. So that's a little bit of background about just some of the examples. But Dave, let's talk about what that even means to license and get into the royalty marketplace. That's what we're talking about here. So what are developers looking to license and for what purposes?
Yeah, for audiovisual content, I mean, really, they're teaching their models what the world looks like and how it operates, right? So they are, think of a model. Somebody once described a model to me like a 5-year-old that remembers everything. So you need to, if a 5-year-old's never seen a camel before, they don't know what it looks like. You have to show them what a camel looks like, how it walks, how it chews, how it spits, whatever. They need to do that for generative video. For basically everything in the world. And so that can be around objects, it can be around ethnicities, it can be around locations, it can really be anything. So I'll leave it there, but that's a start.
I had a interesting licensing deal come across my plate where a generative AI model was looking to specifically build chatbots or voice bots. And they wanted those chatbots or voice bots to sound like people from the 90s. So they were looking for 90s based movies and TV shows that use the slang, the vernacular, um, anything that someone like me would have said in the 90s or would have known in the 90s. They wanted to train their bots to speak like me, the younger version of me. So it can be that specific or that niche.
Well, that gets to at least what I've seen in the marketplace in my discussions, where I'm trying to kind of serve as this, this glue to bring the companies together, which is that it started many, many months ago where there was very broad-based licensing, and then it's become, at least from what I'm seeing, narrower and narrower to more fine-tuning. And so, Mickey and Dave, why don't you talk about that a little bit, just how in the past, since you've started in this world, how you've seen the marketplace evolve?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still seeing a lot of both. So we're having a lot of conversations of just and negotiating deals that are pretty massive and pretty broad, and then we have other deals that are, just like Mickey was describing, that are getting very specific. I think that the trend and the long-term direction of travel will be towards more specificity. But it's we're still in the really early stages of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we expect something like $10 billion of licensing deals to be done this year. And most of it still is in the training side of things. We expect it to shift at some point to more prompt inputs or IP-based outputs. But I'm seeing AI developers look for hundreds of thousands of hours of generic audio or video content. Any music that you can get, generally speaking, just for training data purposes. I do see more IP based or more niche fine tuning deals come across my plate, more so now or more so recently than I've seen before. But the money is still in the large scale of data that's being used for training.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll add just one last
yeah,
thing because
please.
it goes with some, we not to tout Protege too much today. My company's Protege, but we did an announcement today that is right sort of in the ballpark of this, Peter. We announced the ability to do essentially highly curated shots. So instead of licensing 10,000 hours of, movies or TV shows or documentaries or whatever, if they just want camels or they just want certain camera motions or something else, we can go into our fairly massive catalog and go curate exactly that and provide that for them. So that obviously gets sold at a premium.
Well, congratulations, first of all, for
Thank
that.
you.
That's very cool. Very timely, by the way, for
Very timely. Yes.
but it's interesting because Mickey, you mentioned $10 billion this year is what you expect, which, as far as I've seen, and I watch this stuff very closely, the biggest deal that's been publicly announced is $250 million, I believe, which is still the News Corp deal that was struck over the course of 5 years. And so $10 billion it sounds like a lot. And I'll give a little personal anecdote about that. But first of all, $10 billion is, let me do the math, 1% of the $1 trillion, I think that I had mentioned at the very top. So it's 1%. So a funny anecdote, when I was talking to a senior executive at one of the major AI developers, this person was bemoaning the fact that a media company was actually requesting $1 billion. And I reminded that person that is a drop in the bucket compared to what is being spent on all the infrastructure and everything like that. So there is still this fundamental disconnect that you see between the content creative community and the AI developers. And it's pretty remarkable to me. It seems like just the language being used in terms of the conversations is still very much, there needs to be an understanding of the value of content. And I guess one of the things I want to get into is, and I guess, Mickey, I'll open it up for you on this, which is in these deals where, well, I'll open it up to all of you. The main terms of these deals, like the main terms, we can't get into the minutia. how would you define what, there's certainly the price, but get into how that's thought of. And it's going to be different for video and music and textual content. But why don't you first start with the video a little bit and just some of the essential terms of a deal?
Well, essential terms in terms of what the content owner is trying to dictate or what the generative AI developer is trying to dictate, because sometimes they're in conflict.
Well, if you're doing a term sheet,
Yeah.
like the high level, let's not get too much into the weeds, but just very high level, let's touch upon them.
Well, I would say definitely price is first and foremost. What the content is, what rights are being, what rights the content owner actually has and what rights they don't, what the content can actually be used for, in what models, term, length of the deal, whether or not the actual content can be utilized as IP in the outputs, or is it just simply generalized training data that goes into the model and generally trains it with no necessarily link or evidence that IP was trained on in the output. So stuff like that.
Dave, is there anything else that you've seen? Howie and Rebecca, I'd like to just let's put aside price for this for the moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. I think, one of the things that where a lot of time is spent is on the restrictions. So what can't a buyer do with the content? What rights aren't included? So for example, with audiovisual content, it's pretty common that that somebody who's licensing a movie wouldn't have the music rights necessary for model training. It's pretty common that they wouldn't have name, image, likeness rights on everybody who appears in those works. So those kinds of things get restricted.
Yeah.
Please
History.
go ahead, Howie.
Okay. History tells us what happens in these circumstances. Like you talked about getting fair value. Remember, Napster offered $1 billion to the industry. That was $14 billion. And by the way, the $1 billion covered 5 years. It wasn't even a one-time payment up front. So it is always the case that the companies who are trying to stay in the gray area don't want to offer fair value. But we've been down this road before, right? There were new business models. There was YouTube as an example.
Yeah.
That was required to at first license and later develop its own technology called Content ID to enable accurate records of what content was being used. It's harder given the fact that this content is going through a blender in some cases and being turned into all these billions of parameters. And so figuring out the right payments are going to be hard. So we're going to see on the music side, I think, shorter term deals. We're going to see, less complicated financial structures. In the past, they've been flat rate deals covering a period of time, but a lot of data sharing. So that after let's say it's a 2-year deal, there's information to figure out how do we do it in a better way in the future? Because we don't really know today. We're not even sure that it's going to be possible to attribute outputs to the precise training material that was used, unless, as Dave described, there's this very narrow camel database that we can focus on.
Yeah. And so let's I want to focus on one issue that has become let's talk about that in a second. Pricing. Since we have all forms of media represented here, which is great. Rebecca, let's start with you. So when you looked at with as much specificity as you can, how is the pricing discussion approached in the world that you were in with the New York Times? So textual, I don't know, video is involved in that deal, but you can say as much as you want about that, but just how you approach pricing with Amazon in that deal and what you're seeing in the world that you are, like news gathering.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be really hard for me to be specific here, but I can talk to you generally about how we think about, why the Times is unique and why the Times and other quality publishers like us should command a pretty high price for what we're providing. I mean, we believe that the quality that we have in our content is just very different from what they're getting elsewhere on what they would describe as the open web, which, is a phrase we don't agree with or believe in. And that they need this kind of quality content to make sure that their products continue to be useful and valuable to their consumers. And so without kind of paying the right price, and establishing some of the right terms that these guys were just describing, including I would add the outputs of content, right? Like you want to make sure they're not, if in our case, creating entirely substitutive experiences where you go to an Amazon or another, product like it, a chat experience, for instance, and you get highly substitutive experiences where you never need to go to any other publisher, like we're seeing on AI mode in Google, for instance. So we think about the quality that we're providing. In the case of the Times, we do, obviously, we have a 174 years of news that we could offer, including current news where have dozens of bureaus around the world and human people, reporting from around the world and, doing videos and audio. So there's just a lot of value there. Plus we have a cooking product. Plus we have a sports product. We've not done a deal yet for games or Wirecutter, really deliberately. They're super different models. And so it's both the quality and the breadth is just going to command a high price. And
But that's the question. When you have a blank slate, like this is an entirely new industry. It's like what I was talking about when we were talking about streaming video and YouTube came up with Content ID. None of the figures that ultimately are decided upon are ordained from the heavens. So where does it even come from? Like, how do you, in your mind, set the price?
I don't have a math equation for you, unfortunately. And if anyone does have one, I'd be interested in it.
Like that's the challenge for everybody out there, is that to understand that there is no magic price and it's being created in real time. So the people here on this video in this conference are setting the rules of the game that everybody will be following.
That's right. And that's why I think you want to maintain that sense that this is really high quality that they can't get in other places and that they need to pay for in the same way that they're paying for compute. Peter, you were just pointing out, or, engineers, which we understand they're paying a lot of money for in many places. And so I do think it's not a math equation. It's a little bit of art and science. And making sure that you're holding pretty firm to what you believe is your value.
And
exactly. I would say,
go ahead.
Yeah, if you don't mind if I add to that.
No, please do.
So we expect $10 billion in licensing deals this year. This means there is some odd billion that has already been done. So there are market comps for content that have been parts of deals. And I think if you're looking at what happens today, those market comps are somewhat known. They're somewhat shared. I think everyone on this panel probably knows what they are. And essentially, you're licensing your content based at some multiple of that market comp or at that market comp, depending on how you value the content, how niche or scarce it is, or how quality it is. So, for example, if I'm an AI developer and I just want to go out and license as much video as possible, I'm probably going to pay under market because I can get video from a lot of places, right?
What is market?
For video, I've seen anywhere from $25 an hour to $250 an hour.
Okay. That on the high end, 250 is what you
Yeah.
say.
And then like if you look at the high end, it's like, is this stuff scarce? Is it niche? Is it difficult to get? Is it quality? Is it how much 90s high quality content of people talking is there? If there's a very scarce amount and the major studios aren't necessarily jumping into this, so now you're limiting the pool or the supply even further because, okay, if the major studios aren't necessarily diving right into this licensing stuff, then who's got 90s content? Well, there's not very much.
let me ask you about you mentioned quality, but quality is seen differently between the content community frequently and the researchers on the AI side.
Yeah, it opens up for some very interesting and contentious conversations, I think.
Yeah, so Dave, help the audience understand that a little bit.
Yeah, so it is interesting. So it- one example, we worked with an AI company that wanted a lot of what they called cinematic content. So we delivered them a bunch of cinematic content. We delivered them a bunch of movies, a bunch of series, mostly dramatic stuff. Had a nice subset of horror content in it as one example. Turns out that, horror content is pretty bad for AI training because it tends to be filmed with a really shaky camera to have that urgency, tends to be, low lighting, maybe, just kind of hard to see, right? So cinematic content, when what we've kind of learned is what the AI companies really want when they say cinematic tends to be really well lit, really crisp images, really smoothly shot. So one example,
Good structure and good labeling as well.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
metadata.
lot of nuance to what a human being thinks is good content versus what's good for training.
Yeah, the metadata is for the developers and their licensing. That's something that the more the better, essentially, right? And then there's a critical piece that opens up a whole other area, which I think is underreported, under-discussed, which is that the content owners, at least from what I'm seeing, are always asked to give representations and warranties. So back up that they have the rights to be given when they're licensing the content, which is another reason why I believe the studios are hesitant or have been uncomfortable so far licensing their content, because they need to give reps and warranties and indemnification. So if there's a risk and something comes back to, the AI developers are sued after a content licensing deal. And one big area of risk is the individual talent deals, the individual talent. And so something that I think a lot of people don't understand is that we're talking about licensing copyrighted works, but there's individuals who who are involved in the copyrighted work. So like in a movie, think of an actor like Tom Cruise. And the talent community would take the position that even if Tom Cruise is working as in a work made for hire for a motion picture, that his persona, his ones and zeros that are in a training data set was not part of that work for hire document, that it opens up a whole different area of rights of publicity and biometrics. And I'm putting a little teaser out there that coming soon to a theater near you, there may be some of those kind of claims that are brought. So, everybody who's out there in the licensing world, it goes beyond just the fact that you have a license with a willing content owner. There's the individuals who make up that content who also will say they have a say. And Howie, if you have any thoughts about that too.
Yeah, I was going to go somewhere else, which is one of the other factors we haven't talked about is that, we can have a view of what a fair price is. Rebecca has a view and the New York Times has a view of what their content, high quality content is worth. But, you walk into the room with somebody that wants to license the material, but they have another option, which is, I'll just go take it.
Right.
And so that depresses.
And they are.
And they are. And that's the reason why there are these suits. So there is this balancing act. The value of that content is depressed to some degree because there's a pirate marketplace out there. I'm not saying it's all the same high quality stuff. I'm not saying it's everything but I bet that Rebecca mentioned that the Wirecutter has not yet been licensed as content from the Times. I bet we could find it in a model somewhere though, that it's been used, right? So that's
I'm confident we can.
Yeah. I'm sure we can. And so this is always one of the issues is that the people walking in the door, some of them want to act ethically and start right from the beginning and license it. But, we've heard from their investors, they've said it publicly that if this company was licensing music for their models, I wouldn't have invested in it. Right. Yeah. So there's this view that it's okay to take it. Right. And it's okay to take every novel by Stephen King and train a model on that. and write new Stephen King content.
And the investor, the VC you were talking about is, I believe either Suno or Udio said that, and they're the ones who admitted in their court filings that they scraped the entirety of recorded music that's available online. You know, they concede that, and because they can't help it.
Why these cases are so important, and so much is being read into every ruling by each judge. What we know is this is a long haul. The fact that some cases go one way and some cases go the other. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer, but I've been involved in enough court cases from the music side to know this is going to take time to play out. And, you know, one way to think about this is that, you know, my background's in operations research and game theory and things like that. And, you know, one good strategy is to minimize your maximum risk. And if both sides believe they have very big risks of not making deals, they'll make deals. And so if the companies scraping everything on the net believe they'll get away with it for sure, they won't come to the table and make a reasonable deal. If the rights holders believe they're sure to win everything and they'll put these companies out of business because they're going to owe such huge statutory infringement payments, then they won't do a deal. And minimizing the maximum risk is what's going to drive people to make a deal now. But when every court case is, you know, it's like reading tea leaves, you know, some ways the best thing that could happen is both sides win some, both sides lose some, because it's going to make people come to the table and make a more reasonable deal.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, ultimately there's all the litigation ongoing, and you know, it's what you said, Howie, when it came to YouTube. YouTube built its value initially, built its scale on the backs of the creative community through copyright infringement, by enabling copyright infringement. And it was only after the industry pressure with that major litigation where magically they were able to come up with their content ID system, create the technology. And, you know, the pressure that the New York Times and others are putting out there, this is the way that change will happen. And ultimately, it's in everybody's interest. It's going to go that way. It's in everybody's interest because friction is holding back. Like we were talking, litigation friction is holding back the studios as just one example from wanting to do what they want to do, which is utilize these tools. So the best way to take away that friction, of course, is through entering into a cooperative system, which absolutely will happen because it has to happen. But the court cases, and I am a lawyer, although, you know, I'm primarily a business guy, but once a lawyer, you're always a lawyer. So I follow this stuff very, very closely. And I'll tell you, the initial, we don't have time for it, but the initial fair use rulings that just came down in the last week or the last couple of weeks, they were, the tech community would say that there were victories on the fair use, but I would say as objectively as possible, that if you read the language, particularly if you read the language in the Meta case, in the Kadri versus Meta case, that is screaming to reject fair use. And so I think that's very favorable for the overall creative community and everybody we're talking about here. And Dave, I'll ask you, just in terms of what you've seen pre-fair use decisions and the vibes you're feeling right now, what has changed, if anything, in the kinds of discussions that you're having?
It's changing pretty significantly. So, you know, going back like a year ago, we were having a conversation with somebody in Silicon Valley, and who was sort of trying to talk me out of the early days of this business. And they said, you know, essentially, gun to my head, I don't think technology companies are ever going to license content for AI training.
Yeah.
From there, you know, it's changing dramatically. You know, in December, there was a note in Forbes or Fortune that with a quote from a banker at Morgan Stanley that they now put a reserve for sort of AI litigation expense or AI, you know, copyright liability in any AI businesses, any relevant AI businesses that they're following. And we're seeing just in the market, there's no question that the companies are leaning in a lot more now than they were 6 months or a year ago, including some companies that you might not expect to, you know, from news reports. So I think it's really good news. I think the momentum's on our side. Still a ways to go. We still have, you know, some strange conversations, including with smaller companies, where they make it pretty clear to us that they like our data, but they could just take it.
Yeah.
You know, so
Smaller
We'll get there.
smaller companies are more willing to take the risk. Mickey, what are you seeing from before and after these initial fair use decisions, if anything's changed?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's directly related to these fair use decisions, but the pendulum has definitely swung in favor of the content owners and the creatives, right? The deals that I'm seeing are large deals. These AI developers are willing to write large checks, and there's a reason for that. And they feel the momentum not going in their way. If they felt the momentum was going in their way, it would be a dead market out there. And I'll just make one finer point on everything. It's to address a comment you made earlier about the 10 billion number seems realistic, but we've only seen X amount in the press.
Yeah.
I think there's a reason for that. I don't think these AI developers want to publicize that they're losing this battle. I don't think they want to accelerate their demise by judges understanding that they're willing to license and they may agree that fair use doesn't apply. So I think there's a reason that you're not seeing a lot of public announcements about licensing content from these developers.
You know what's really interesting about that, without getting in the weeds, but again, I'm a lawyer also. If you look at the 4-factor fair use test, factor 4, which is frequently seen as the most important one, having a vibrant licensing market is a very significant factor there. So it's interesting from an AI developer standpoint where they're arguing fair use, but at the same time they're entering into licensing.
I can't say that I quite understand it, but it is what it is right now.
Yeah. And then Dave and Mickey, just really quickly, because I promised I'd explain, we'll only have a couple of minutes, but explain what your companies do precisely. Dave, I'll start with you.
Sure. So we aggregate audiovisual content to license to AI companies for model training. So we work with about 85 media companies around the world right now. They're across movies, television, sports, a little bit of news. We've got motion capture and some other things. Our content comes from 6 continents. It's highly diverse. And then we enter into license agreements with the AI companies, again, either for kind of broad scale, I need 100,000 hours or something, or really narrow curated data sets.
And Mickey, how about you?
Yeah, Vermilio provides the guardrails for the generative internet through our Trace ID technology. So essentially, we offer a protection service for large content holders, individual talent, anyone. There's a free service you can sign up. And essentially, we can track and trace use of your content or your IP across generative AI models and use cases. And then on the same side of that coin is we allow content owners to take action, whether it's sending takedown notice or to seek compensation. And part of the seeking compensation piece is our technology also functions in helping revenue tracking and attribution and licensing deals. So we help our partners find licensing deals, and we provide the technology that helps them track and ensure those licensing deals are being the contractual terms are being abided by. They have transparency into them, and they know what's going on.
And then I want to ask you, Howie, about the music industry, since you work so closely with them. You, as somebody who's within that community, how are you feeling about the long-term impact of generative AI on an individual musician? What would you tell an individual artist?
I tell what I tell my students, which is start using it, because as a creative tool, it's great. As a tool to allow, Billie Eilish to release a song in 8 languages on the same day and date around the world when she doesn't know how to speak Japanese is a great thing. To give a voice to artists who are no longer able to perform, like Randy Travis, to create a song that his band is now touring again. Because that song got millions of plays on Spotify that he created in the studio using an AI model of his voice. But it's all done with compensation. One of the things we're going to see here is that the licensing market that we're talking about here, as well as the bad actors, there's this band Velvet Sundown that got all these plays on Spotify. the way streaming works, the way traffic gets to the New York Times from Google, it's not that hard to show market harm. If the AI is grabbing the user and is getting the plays on the streaming service, or is satisfying the user's information need, and they don't go on to look at that New York Times article, it's not that hard to prove harm to the marketplace. And that is the thing the judges are saying you're going to need to do in these cases.
And by the way, that's such an important point. And Rebecca, I'm going to leave it with the last word on this, because we have a very short period of time. But what you mentioned there, Howie, is that I think so many people out there believe that there has to be like almost a substantial similarity on the output side, for something to be infringing. And that is not what's being picked up by the courts in the initial decisions. It's this market substitution, which is the Supreme Court came down with that concept as almost like an exception to fair use, even when there's I'm not going to get too technical, transformative use. But Rebecca, so in one of the cases, they mentioned news gathering specifically. So it does, it's not because it's exactly saying the words that the New York Times uses, although that happens sometimes. But I guess just for you and the Times and the news gathering business in general, how do you view the long-term prospects in a world of generative AI?
I mean, look, we look at it with both a lot of optimism and, as I described before, there are plenty of ways that we think AI can be positive for the Times, for content creators. And, we want to set the foundation right so that places like the Times and the rest of the sort of journalism industry can continue to produce the kind of content and journalism that we produce, which will only make the tools better. I mean, if you can imagine a world where we don't have sustainable models, what's coming out of those tools to answer people's questions about what's going on in the world? Where are they getting that information? You can't send an AI machine to the front lines of Ukraine to understand how a person has just been impacted by, a bomb that's landed on their doorstep. You can't send an AI robot to a restaurant to say how they think the food is and become our next food critic. You need humans creating this content in a way to make it, valuable and useful to the world. And like I keep saying, the tools need it too. So, we have to set up the right foundation and system for both of us to coexist in this world in a healthy way and to create the right types of commercial models for publishers.
Amen to all of that. And so everybody, thank you. This is a group of problem solvers here who are taking the world as it is with generative AI and all the excitement behind it and looking for ways for everybody to participate fairly in that world, which is the way it has to be. So thanks for everybody joining this great Hollywood, digital Hollywood session. It was a great panel and hope the audience enjoyed it.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Guys.